Well, hello YouTube, and welcome back to the Holtz Missile channel and this big boring job. Well, as you can see, we're back on the Bridgeport, and we have a metering gate body here that we need to bore out. Of course, now it's already bored out, but anyway, I'm doing the intro and outro and stuff after the fact. This was quite a challenge because the dimensions of this thing are pushing the limits of what the Bridgeport can do. Now, there's a few little items that I'll show you here in the setup as to how we got this thing placed on the table. There's, see, 6 holes for the face where the impeller, so to speak, of the metering gate goes in, and it's guided by the end caps. And so I'm guessing this thing was made to CNC, and so the holes should be exactly opposite one another. So when we flip this thing over, that the alignment of the blocks on the table will be okay. So anyway, here's how we do the setup on the table. Yeah. Now, as you can see, what I did is I made some studs that fit in the slot of the table and also into the holes of the 1, 2, 3 blocks. A nice snug fit. Still a slip fit, but you know, to where there wasn't a whole lot of slop. That way I've got a positive guide now. The other thing is I've got 10mm holes on my 1, 2, 3 blocks. I made these metric. So what I did is I took a M10 bolt, a shouldered bolt, and turned it down to an M8 thread because I had some T-nuts that I had lying around with an M8 thread in them, so that happened to fit the table, so that's the reason I used them. Other than that, I probably just would have had to make a new set of T-nuts and just an M10 thread, which I'll probably do later on anyway. But for the sake of expediency, what I did is I just grabbed a couple of bolts, threw them on the lathe, turned them down, cut some threads on them, boom, threw them in the table, and away we go. Rather than go through the rigmarole of having to make a whole slew of T-nuts. But again, for those of you who do have one of these things, if you have the time and you're making stuff like this, like T-nuts, make a whole different variety of sizes. Make them, you know, if you're using metric from M6 to M14, which is the slot size on this table, you know, in the 2mm increments, or if you're using the imperial sizes, make yourself a set of each nominal size, you know, 1/4, 3/8, you know, 5/16, yada yada yada. And then that way you'll have a set for, you know, on the ready for anything that comes up like this. I knew I was going to need something like this sooner or later, so I just improvised with what I had. But I will be making a whole complete set of nominal sizes on the T-nuts, so that way I have them, and then so when projects like this do come up, bang, I'm ready to rock and roll. So anyway, enough of that rant. So here's how we wound up setting up the corpus of the thing on here. I don't have the actual footage where we set the thing on the blocks, but you know, you'll see how the blocks are set up and then how this thing goes on. Now, I had to go back and tear it all down and redo it. What happened, this is something that bit me in the ass and I wasn't aware of it. I couldn't explain why I was having some gap underneath one of on one side of the 1, 2, 3 blocks. And as it turned out, this corner was riding up on the table, so I had to rotate it and set the whole thing back up. But the principle's still the same. I used the stud that I made here in the slot in the hole to put in the hole on the not V block, but the 1, 2, 3 block on the table. Get it lined up. So now we're getting ready to turn this, as you can see by some of the footage here. That this was kind of a tedious process. Now, one of the things too that I encountered is the wear on the dovetails on the machine here, especially for the height of the table. And normally you just, when you run out of quill, stop, run your table up, and then keep on going. Well, there's enough slop in that where it made a difference, and so what I wound up doing is I set the brake just ever so slightly, enough to give it tension, but not to stop it to where you couldn't crank it up anymore. And then I advanced the table up, started up at the top, and then advanced the table up until I got to where the back flange here was almost touching the back of the head of the machine. And then I started using the quill feed, and now we've got about a little over half an inch maybe to go. So now we're going to flip this thing over and then put the quill, or put the boring head back in, center it all up, because it's probably going to be off ever so slightly, I'm guessing. and then run out the cutter to where it's touching the thing again, and then we're going to cut on the upstroke. So not sure if I'm going to invert the knife or just leave it in the way it is and then just cut with the thing. I'll probably just invert it. I've set this up to where the boring bar, I had to make a new boring bar, by the way, for this thing. I'll bring the camera around here and show you guys the setup and explain it all. So, okay, here I've got my boring bar. I had to, like I say, make a new one. I didn't have one that was quite long enough. I made it open-ended. Just took a little grub screw, stuck it in there. Now, as you notice, it's not quite off-centered, but it's enough to where it'll cut this cast. And I didn't have enough material really to run this this piece of HSS. What am I looking for? Off-center. So I off-centered it as much as I could, and then ground the corner here to where it's almost centered on the hub of the boring bar, or the boring head itself. And I've got a flat on each side of the boring bar that sticks into the head. And then what else I did is one of the grub screws has a point on it. The other one has a flat. So the flat is for the alignment to keep this thing nice and perpendicular, or plumb. And then the grub screw with the point on it actually pulls this bar in, because I offset the dimple just ever so slightly, just a few tenths, to where when you tighten it up, it pulls it up tight against the corpus of the boring head. So that's the setup on that. YouTubers, here's a shot of the metering gate where it's been installed. Here's also some stills of the finished product, the work piece after it's been bored, right here. And here are some of the pictures of some of the assembly in progress. Now you can see that there's a set of, it's not a rubber, it's some kind of other plastic or whatever it is that rotates, that's on the lips of the metering gate itself. And this is to create an airtight seal. Now, the unit itself was actually quite a close fit, and what happens with this thing, it's a metering gate on an ash discharge for a filter system. And so what happens when the fuel that's being burnt is a little wet, there's a lot of condensate in the exhaust. And of course, that goes into the ash, it's absorbed into the ash, and as the ash falls out into the collection trough and goes through the metering gate, it attacks the metal underneath. And this thing, of course, is cast, or cast iron, I should say. And so that turns into a, what do you call it? Not an acid, but a base. And so it attacks the metal and pits it deeply. And we had an incident where recently where the thing stood still for a few days, and the condensate in the exhaust caused it to freeze up, and so it was a real pain in the butt to get the thing apart. I had to make a puller, or a pusher I should say, to push the thing out, and then we took a sledgehammer and a block of wood and drove the thing out, in addition to using the puller or the pusher to drive it. We don't have a press here in the shop, so that's the one way we did it. Then of course bored it out, turned the meter and gate on the lathe, and gave the whole thing a little bit more play, because when the iron starts to corrode, the corrosion actually grows. It causes it to increase in size and then close up the gap between the meter and gate and the corpus and the housing, and then it just freezes up, and then you're really hosed. So I gave it a little more gap so that there's a little more free play in there. We've got about a millimeter gap now, whereas before it was in the tenths. So with those lips on there, we still got our airtight seal, and the unit's back on the machine, in its place. Here's a shot of it. So what you saw there is the unit mounted, but it's also got the heater, and you know, if the heater's there for when condensate comes in the wintertime and freezes, or if it wants to freeze, that it keeps it in a thawed state, so that the condensate and the ash don't freeze and cake up and cause the thing to plug up. So there's a heater on there, like a heat tape, and then the housing with the insulation on there. So that's essentially a wrap for this. I'm sorry if I, couldn't include some of the lathe footage and some of the other footage on there. It was just mainly to highlight the boring of the housing and show the overlength boring bar. I had a real problem with chatter with it too, because, well, one, it's a small small diameter boring bar. I used the biggest I could get and use and find for that particular application. I should have probably used a 20 millimeter diameter as opposed to the 16. That probably would have made it a little more stable. Of course, keep that in mind for the next go around. But I had a pretty small tool bit that I had to work with, and so just one of those things, of course. And then the tool bit not being, or the cutting edge of the tool bit being a little ahead of center, also helped create some of that chatter. So it also dulled the tool quite often, so I had to resharpen fairly often. So those are just little lessons learned. Like I said, it was just something I had to throw together on the fly. I didn't have a whole lot of time to get it done. So there is a little bit of footage missing there that should have been thrown in. I do apologize if there's some gaps there in the whole thing. So that's why I'm throwing a little bit of monologue in there to kind of supplement the footage that's there. So anyway, if there's any thoughts, critiques, of course I do expect some critiques on this, and like I said, I do apologize. It is what it is, and so I hope you guys aren't too disappointed in the missing footage. So anyway, but if there's suggestions, comments, critiques, thoughts, or other experiences that might help other folks out there that are faced with a similar problem, I use 3 languages at work often enough, and so sometimes they kind of go in your head and in your mouth and in your mind, and it all gets crossed up, and so it's kind of hard to separate. But anyway, for those folks who have different experiences, by all means, do contribute your experiences in the comment section below. It will be greatly appreciated, because there's probably going to be somebody else out there that may or may not be faced with a similar situation, and good advice is always good to have. So Anyway, with that, thank you guys for stopping by and taking interest in the channel. For those of you who are new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe, give it a thumbs up and all that good jazz. Trying to, you know, bump the channel up in ratings. So with that, thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you guys all again soon.